Welcome to the Quantum City Initiative, a show about the most important stories, ideas at the intersection of AI, cities, real estate, and the leaders shaping the future of how and where we live and work. Do you save and reinvigorate cities, or are you building new ones?
What is most critical for cities in the future with the sort of AI factory race to work? All right, EP 35, the QCI show. How you doing, Chase?
I'm doing all right. How are you?
It's good. It's summer.
You got a little like World Cup hangover?
I'm bummed, man. It's over. The fact that it's over is, I guess, fine. The finals. I was more bummed when I didn't have like 5 games a day to watch. So when it went from group stage down to, round of 16, that's when I sort of had my biggest hangover because I was like, oh, there's not a game on. What do I do?
It was a great cup.
It was a good run. I mean, listen, I don't know what else to do with the rest of my summer now. I was going to ask you what else is going on this summer.
I don't know. I wasn't thinking past the World Cup.
Now we have nothing to do.
I guess we'll talk about real estate.
There is some real estate stuff going on this week. There's a lot of news this week, which is interesting timing because it is late July. It is August. Generally, things tend to cool down, but there's still a lot of transactions that are happening. And there's a lot of news in our favorite topic is power, industrial, and AI. So let's jump right in. The anchor story this week. And this isn't entirely new, but I just love that there's some really good hard numbers here. Okay, Brookfield Asset Management, the Canadian Pension Plan Investment Board, CPP Investments, agreed to take LXP Industrial Trust private in a $5.2 billion all-cash deal. Okay, so what does that mean? Brookfield comes in and pays a 20% premium over the 90-day average for the stock. So when you think about these REITs, Chase, I think a good friend of ours, BXP, Pat Mulvihill, used to joke about it. I know Jonathan Gray did something similar where the actual REITs were trading less than the combined net asset value of the individual assets. So tell me a little bit about your take on this deal, why the premium's important, and what this means for Brookfield and really where the money's going today in the market.
I think Brookfield, LXP in particular, I think had taken years to sell off office and become pure play industrial, which probably explains that 20% premium, right? You've got durable, occupied, long leased industrial, which a lot of people want to sit there because the industrial guys are still taking long leases, unlike an office. It's a little surprising how the public markets were trading this. You referenced John Gray's famous equity play where he chopped up equity office for, I think it was like an 18-month jujitsu move, maybe a little less, right before the great financial crisis. So we've seen kind of similar, I would say, disagreements in pricing between public and private before. I don't think we're necessarily looking at a massive crash where they're going to need to necessarily sell off a bunch of these assets versus probably recapitalize and sit on a bunch of them. This is kind of in parallel with the CMBS special servicing rose 1.72% in June. Office CMBS delinquencies near 18%. So that's up 150 bips in 1 year. So the bottom kind of keeps falling out on the wrong product in office. And I think some of that scares people from the right category of office, which obviously I think there's some significant supply constraints that Cushman covered in their Q2 market beat. So if you're sitting on those assets, you're probably doing pretty well. We just need more.
Are we going to see, we've talked about the underwriting issues. We've talked about the logjam. We're going to talk about CMBS in a little bit, some of the mortgage-backed securities. We've talked about high interest rates. The Fed, we're indicating perhaps hikes. Are we going to see more of perhaps this notion of private capital coming in more to these industrial deals? Because to be honest, the biggest public capital going to this, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, is the tech companies. It's Google, because this is industrial to a degree. It's not necessarily AI. Are we going to see more private capital? Are we going to see more take privates as sort of the underwriting thesis of commercial real estate changes?
If industrial is trading below NAV, then probably. I hadn't followed LXP closely. So the fact that there's a 20% premium in a category that's, currently the pretty girl at the dance, I would imagine if it continues to trade that way, then yes.
Yeah, I like that. Okay, next section, let's talk quantum review. This is an interesting one. We've had a lot of our folks, shout out to Steve Dietz, on the road traveling to a couple of cities that aren't necessarily your tier one cities. We've talked about Steve Case's Rise of the Rest. We've certainly covered Miami quite a bit. We've covered Austin quite a bit. We've covered New York quite a bit. Let's talk about Phoenix, the future quantum city here. Phoenix is the clearest single city metro. Office is turning. It's not soaring, but the trends are there. Office vacancy is only 20% compared to some of the other markets right there. But industrial is the story around the Rise of the Rest. The Engine ranked Phoenix number one in the city in the country for semiconductors, with more than 60 industry expansions since 2020. If, Chase, to what you were just talking about in the Cushman Wakefield report, if the money is following semiconductors, if it's following industrial, if it's following a lot of these trends, we know folks are moving out of New York into some of the other markets like in Texas. Will a city like Phoenix not necessarily see the boom in industrial? We think that's already there. Will it see the real boom in population growth with regards to commercial and office? Will office follow to these cities?
You'll definitely see some of that trend for sure, right? You still have knowledge work that needs to happen in and around where you're seeing advanced manufacturing and anything with regards to AI. I think Phoenix, when you think about the, let's say, individual liberty perspective, no state income tax, very low regulatory drag. They're probably the closest city, both from a heat perspective, but from a regulatory perspective, to Dubai's kind of like fast to yes. So very business friendly legal environment in terms of getting things built. You mentioned it's the number one US semiconductor cluster, TSMC, and Intel. The big knock on Phoenix is it is car dependent to the extreme. So it's sprawl. They have it's called the Valley Metro Rail. So I think it covers like a fraction of the metro. It gets to 110 degrees during the summer, which means walking for most normal human beings is out of the question. So it's lacking some of the, I guess, transit backbone that I think could help improve it. And with that sprawl, then when you think about kind of citizen-centric design, that's a little tough. When you think about affordability, obviously it's considered Sunbelt, and Sunbelt's better than, say, the coastal gateways. But from wage to rent, it's a little bit stretched. But it's really the heat factor where that's going to force certain kind of user experience you'd want to see. And because of the transit, it makes some of those things difficult.
So let's talk about transit. A lot of golf courses, by the way, which is great. Let's talk about transit for a second. My question, so what immediately came to mind when you were talking about transportation, transit, we know the commute is a significant factor with regards to office, city planning, citizen-centric design, all of that. My question for you is, like, with a city like Phoenix, which like you sort of outlined, struggles with regards to the public transit options, do you take the time, money, and effort to invest in a rail system or something along those lines? Or does it matter anymore because every city will inherently have a much more citizen-centric design when Tesla rolls out and Waymo rolls out, and Waymo's there, but the robo taxi comes out. Like, are we going to be arguing? Basically, I guess my question is, does transportation sort of score matter now, or will it matter in the future when we have fully autonomous vehicles and fully autonomous Ubers?
So I think it's always going to matter, but I think you're raising a good point, which is when you think about what AI is enabling, which is essentially mass customization, the way to think about that from a transit perspective is, the really good subway systems could get leapfrogged, right? When you think about you cannot customize your destination nearly as much on rail system, whereas essentially if you create the infrastructure, like what does next gen cities transit infrastructure look like with autonomous vehicles? So you're going to have, instead of say subway stations, you're going to have autonomous vehicle stations such that you have points for the vehicles for optimal pickup times and things like that.
Charging and all that.
I think transportation infrastructure will always remain. Getting from point A to point B in a city is going to be always important. But I think your point is correct, which is I don't think the kind of emerging cities, and Phoenix does, I think they were an early Waymo, if not the first. I forget if it's like them or Austin or whatever. But I think the right way to think about it is not, hey, how's it been done in the past, like the London Tube or New York, or certainly not the T in Boston. But, and I'm not a T hater, so I want that on the record. I'm not a T hater.
It's part of the experience as you think about citizen-centric design.
Instead of, all right, I got to get to this T station and then get on a bus or walk or whatever. Obviously, autonomous vehicles are going to make things significantly more efficient from point A to point B without taking multiple modes of transportation, different stops, all this stuff. So I think the question is like the infrastructure for that version of the world and the best transit hubs are going to be very different looking than, say, subway. So is that going to mean for like more tunneling? Obviously, this
Tunnel.
Pun intended, all roads lead back to Elon, but there can you make cities more green if you have certain structural setups, which is like, all right, if it's an over, I don't know, 2-3 miles, I'm sure you could put math to this, which is truly that kind of 15-20 minute city. If you're saying, okay, and then circumference of a city is X, what type of trip are you taking over a certain amount of distance where you need to go a certain amount of speed? That should happen underground, right? And then you're going to have more people coming up where obviously you get to the last 10% of your location, or if it's just a half mile, is a grid pattern better maybe, right? Which obviously New York got that right for many years. So I think the infrastructure will look differently. And I'm sure there's a bunch of research from the autonomous companies thinking about what's the optimal kind of design for just the transportation infrastructure in ways where you can probably get more green space. You can probably store the vehicles out of sight, out of mind, things like that. So I think there's very exciting future. And then when you think about these like Western or Southern cities, like in Texas, Phoenix, whatever, where you are sitting on 250 years plus of everybody crammed up against the Eastern Seaboard. And Boston's setup, for example, is literally based on the old cow paths, which is bonkers. How do you have more space to clean slate, start fresh?
Do you think, I have two other questions. Do you think, we've talked about the eVTOLs, which is electric vehicle propulsion, whatever. They're flying cars.
Just call them flying cars.
They're flying cars. They're flying cars. So you hear about the flying car launches. You hear about some of the tests. Uber, I think, is doing a good job. There's a couple of private aviation out of New York, which is basically just helicopters landing on top of buildings. With regard to the cities of the future, I don't know if that can be done in Manhattan, obviously, given the skyline. How far away, and do you think that flying cars or transportation, you were talking about underground, you get more green space underground. If you're traveling above the ground, candidly in the air, do you think that's a reality in, call it, the next 5 years, the next 10 years, as you think about city planning, or as folks think about where to choose their office and take their 10-year lease and all of that? Transportation is important. We talked about rail systems. We talked about roadways. Where does the eVTOL and the flying cars come into this?
5 years, I peg it at 50% chance, yes, in the Middle East. 10 years, closer to 90%.
In the Middle East or in the States?
Middle East. They're already, I think their pilots are scheduled. Another good pun there. Pilotless.
Nice.
But yeah, you're going to have the major American flying car companies. I think each have, there's 2 or 3 of them that have contracts with different kind of whatever the different segments of the UAE are called. And then maybe there's some in like Bahrain, and I forget exactly which of the monarchy is over there, but they're already signed and they were talking about the pilot programs. I forget if it was end of 25 or end of 26. I don't know if they got off the ground, but
wow. What about the States? I get the Middle East. We'll talk about Dubai in a minute. Is that a reality here for the States?
Well, I think it's inevitable everywhere at some point. The annoying thing is that when you're the leader and the incumbent rather than the emerging player, you start to see these like moments where you kind of rest on your laurels and forget. Go west, young man. People went west in this country because there weren't nearly as much rules and red tape and, societal standards that held people back. Very pioneering culture. And there's certain things, as a obviously big proponent of democracy, that it gets right. But if you get whether it's foreign interests or populist movements against certain innovation, which you're seeing with data centers and things like that, the crowd can hold these things back, and you have some opportunistic politicians. You're seeing this. The All-In guys talked about it a lot this past week about the data centers, where they're talking about how bad it is for water consumption and electricity. And they kind of walk through, first off, golf courses are terrible for water consumption.
And chemicals, pollute.
Yeah, and a lot of these recycle their own water, so it's not true. And then if you let them do the energy, quote unquote, behind the meter rather than drawing from the public grid, then they can be additive in certain circumstances. But if the people don't want it, then it becomes difficult. And then you get more entrenched bureaucrats who make things difficult. You see it in, at this point, when you look at commercial office, it's data center and commercial office. I think most of the gridlock at this point is because it's not a question of what the market is looking for, right? When we look at those 20% vacancy rates and the CMBS delinquencies, it's not there's no more fog of war, what's happening with return to work, any of that. But the gridlock is how easy do you make it to build the new product that's needed?
So my last question which is on sort of Phoenix. One of the questions that we also ask some of our guests when we get them on is like, what's a headline that people aren't talking about that you'll read in sort of 12 months from now? My thought about, again, just in the past couple of shows, we've talked about really the rise of the rest. We've talked about city expansion. We've talked about just an insane amount of capital going to basically every city outside of LA, SF, New York, Boston, and so on. You're seeing obviously Phoenix, you're seeing Texas, you're seeing Miami, you're seeing a handful of others, you're seeing Pennsylvania as a state continue to grow. Obviously, the majority of that capital is going towards the industrial and the AI side of the house, but we do know that commercial and office and residential will likely follow that. So my sort of question for you is that headline in 24 months that we see population decline? We know companies are moving out of New York. We know, and then maybe that's a political thing. We know companies are moving out of California. Maybe that's a political and the taxes thing. But with regards to infrastructure and opportunity, will we see truly Steve's case, rise of the rest right now, where folks absolutely flood the Sun Belt and the sort of tier one coastal cities that we know and sort of have our office in now in Boston really struggle with regards to rent and occupancy and everything?
Yeah, I think it's what's interesting about kind of this like market K curve is some of it, we talked a lot about it for the last, I don't know, since January 1, right? Like half year plus, where the K curve around what the industry controls in terms of quality of product and things like that it's pretty clear in the data. I think now the emerging factor is what's the business and regulatory climate, market by market. So the other thing that, again, in occupancy and delinquency data that's showing up is it's not just kind of K curve, but you're getting these like market by market trends, right? So I do think business climate and regulatory is going to have a huge impact. And where I think there's like going to be different interpretations and bets made are where you have kind of the scale economies and network economies of, say, the Bay Area around tech talent and then New York City, which wins out? Like how much kind of suboptimal business policy and regulatory red tape, how powerful are these scale and network economies? You had seen the Bay Area really eroding through COVID, and it wasn't just Bay Area, it was all of California, right? And then there's that just massive draw of AI back, and you still have the pockets in Austin, but kind of that buzz around Miami becoming a tech hub is at least the buzz. I don't have any data, but that's died down. So that's going to be kind of the put in the call, right? In terms of, I don't think a lot of people who are hot on the everybody's leaving New York trend would have called the leasing numbers and recovery in office, with the Mamdani win where he's not seen as business friendly, and what you're seeing happening in New York, like those are powerful moats, man. Those are powerful moats.
I'm bearish on New York, Boston, LA, and SF. Bearish. That's my 24-month headline from now. Hopefully I'll be eating some humble pie. So we have a lot of customers and clients in those, but I'm incredibly bullish on the Phoenix and a lot of these Sunbelt cities that are investing enormous amounts of capital. You're going to love this next story.
You're going to put your money where your mouth is?
Yeah. What do you want to bet?
Oh, I didn't know if I'm not necessarily against you. I just.
Oh, all right. Well, I'll bet somebody come in, make a comment.
What's your trade?
Let's bet. I haven't really structured the spread trade. I think it can be measured by capital inflows to specific cities and people outflows. I think that's probably the way to go. So I'll get some data. I'll get the benchmarks, and we'll see what happens in 24 months. You're going to love this next one because you're a big digital twin guy, and I know that about you.
Yeah, I love this.
So what is it? I hate the name. It drives me absolutely bananas. It's driving bananas since the first time I heard digital twin. I couldn't stand it. I get the hives thinking about it. What's a digital twin, man? What's a digital twin? What is it?
I want to twin. I want to digitally twin everything. It's just a digital replica of a physical asset.
So it's a twin.
It's a twin. Yes, it's the digital twin.
I can't stand
one of them is atoms, one of them is bits.
Oh God, put that on a t-shirt. Okay,
I love it.
Fine, whatever. Digital twins, I get it. I joke because we actually do some work, and we actually have a product, and we do some pretty sophisticated digital twin work with some of our customers at the asset level, which is interesting because it's been sort of constrained to the asset level. This is a cool story, and what they're doing here, I think, is super exciting. No surprises in the Middle East. Earlier this month, Dubai launched the digital twin platform, a live virtual replica of the city integrating more than 1,500 geospatial data layers and 3D models of almost 200,000 buildings.
So cool.
So we talked about smart cities. I also hate that name. I think that's silly. I think it's silly. I think every city's still a dumb city, except for maybe now Dubai.
Oh, yeah, dude. Dubai sounds super smart.
Except for maybe now Dubai. So this really goes from smart city to like smart operating system. Why is this for folks, I guess, really sort of tech savvy and tech heavy? You're probably like, duh, guys. Yeah, a digital replica makes an insane amount of sense to sort of run theoretical builds, to run simulations on weather patterns and whatever it may be on a specific city, to run, commute patterns, whatever. Why is this important? And what's the playbook now? And will we see other cities sort of adopt this? And then what goes into something like this? Honestly, it feels like a no-brainer. The future of the city has to have this. I don't understand why every other city doesn't. Dubai is just continuing to do Dubai things.
Look, this is exactly what we wrote about in the first QCI paper, which is, and they've been at this for a while. So people that are not familiar, the concept of a digital twin has been around for a while. So to provide a little bit more information, you have seen.
So I didn't provide enough. I didn't tee it up enough. But continue.
Well, as to what the digital
twin
is, I'll take that. But just so people can visualize it, like think of Minority Report, or there's probably a bunch. Any Tom Cruise movie that's awesome, right? Which is all.
They're making a new Days. What is it? Days of Thunder, I think. I think they're doing. Tom Cruise is doing a reboot. Anyways, go.
They're doing another Top Gun. It's gonna be awesome. The 3D graphical view of that tower. Any CIA movie where they're like, oh, what floor are they on? And they've got that visual of the building and they can locate the bad guy on the 73rd floor or whatever.
Batman did some of that.
Yeah. Batman also great. Christian Bale. So that's kind of the concept of a digital twin. Now, unless you're like chasing down a bad guy, which most people in commercial real estate don't want the liability of that, right? That's not their gig. The kind of like 3D graphical view, it's gimmicky and cool, but it's not necessarily incredibly applicable. Our friend Mark Furness, who just took over his company Ascensus over in London after he's been at it for 20-something years, he's talked about what he calls a logical digital twin. So I'll give him a shout out on that, where it's not necessarily the super fancy graphical user interface on top of it, but rather specific, like regular flat application workflows to actually do things. Once you have everything, every floor, every inch of space, all of the spatial design, all the systems, everything in a building, like what are the applications that you can use if you have that data mapped, and how you can run the building better. Now think of that across 195,000 buildings in terms of how you can run a city better. So your question of, is everyone going to do this? It's a guaranteed probability, like it's guaranteed that at some point, so long as we don't have World War III or the aliens take over or some black swan type events, if the progression of technology continues to go, yes, every city will ultimately have an operating system where it's tied to the buildings, it's tied to infrastructure, like we talked about with regards to transportation, because ultimately city government should operate the city. The city itself will need an operating system, and there will be different designs of these things, right? Dubai, the way to think about Dubai is kind of like the Apple operating system, right? So it's tightly controlled. They essentially run the hardware and the operating system software. So they have Dubai Live, which is their operations layer. Obviously, the people who work in city government there use Dubai Live. And then they have Dubai Here, which is the public application for citizens. And it's probably even a little bit more tightly controlled than Apple, in the sense they don't have whatever their version of an app store would be, but businesses can register. I believe you can put job postings in the application. So that would be the first version of a third party. Say when you go to the Apple App Store, you can do something from a third party, not just from Apple. It is inevitable that every competitive city will have some version of this. Some will look significantly more open source, right? So the software that runs at different buildings might be different, and they'll just need to share data back to, say, the operating system of the city, which for people that are freaking out about, surveillance and all that, number one, legitimate concern. I'm super paranoid about surveillance, have a bit of a tin hat kind of point of view on that. However, you're already sharing a lot of information, whether it's your property
Everything.
taxes, you got to get inspections, you got to do all this. It's just the way they transmit it is super costly with pen and paper and stuff like that. This brings down that cost if you have the right kind of security and architecture in place for what I think is important in terms of privacy. You start to see utopia, right?
Why is this not adopted in more cities? And let's start with that one. You just outlined a narrative that to me makes total sense, and it's absolutely bananas that any sort of city, or let's put it this way, any sort of commercial real estate developer wouldn't have a digital twin across their entire portfolio. Now they'd have to tie into more of the sort of city level data, but why is this? You said it was an imperative. Why is this not? Why are we not reading about this more? Why isn't these current projects in place? Is it that surveillance thing? Is it big brothery?
Number one, it's technically very hard, right?
So are you talking? Okay, so technically, in order to get this done, are you talking about sensors everywhere, right?
You're talking about both. You're talking about hardware in sensors and other types of hardware. You're talking about compute,
Yep.
right? So you
Okay.
do need
Or data
the
centers,
data
right?
infrastructure and things like that. And then from a software development perspective, again, your governance structure, your societal structure is complicated, and where again, I'm very pro-democracy. So I need to make that clear. But when you look at where startups have advantages at times over big, slow incumbents, is you have founders that have vision. They're builders. They're kind of mavericks, right? And they're just going to make this happen. And when you look at the monarchies, particularly like in Dubai and the way the UAE is run, you've got good vision. And they don't need to really ask anybody for permission. They just do it. So when you have a system like ours,
Doesn't sound very democratic, but yeah, okay.
Imagine it's like working in a big corporation where it's like,
Right.
you got to get compliance sign off. You got to get quality assurance. You got to get the architects to validate your tech plans. You got to get feedback from the go-to-market team, whatever it is in terms of what you want to build. They're structured much more like startups, and they don't face the innovator's dilemma of, we have this legacy, right? Everybody has seen that time lapse of Dubai basically being an empty desert before it turned into a very modern metropolitan area. When you look at the States, they face that innovator's dilemma. It's harder to rework legacy than it is to start from scratch on certain things. Dubai didn't totally start from scratch, but they have much more modern infrastructure that they developed this technology for. And I think the path to decision and execution is much simpler. It's smaller. It's one of the areas of the UAE. It's one governed province or whatever it is. They have a lot of structural things right to do this. And they've invested a lot of the areas in the Middle East have invested in, they need their economies to be less hedged on energy, right? You've got oil money for a bunch of them. The Qataris are nat gas, right? So you've got essentially a bunch of people that are using the cash flow from energy to invest in innovation and technology.
What happens when a mythos or a fable get a hold of the digital twin records and the simulations Is that when the Terminator takes over? Or does that create one of the greatest economic booms we've ever seen, because we now can apply some of the greatest minds, both artificial and human, into a true efficient city operating system for economic growth, right?
Yeah. This technology, and everybody who's freaking out about this technology should just remember that technology is neither inherently good or bad. It can be used for either. And so you think about like the Manhattan Project and the development of the atomic bomb and nuclear weapons and things. Bad in the wrong hands, good if it's used for deterrence of bad things. So really, really powerful AI is going to be the exact same thing. It can be used for good or bad. Now, I think the good news when we think about a lot of people have this like, oh, it's uncontrollable, even despite the mythos marketing of kind of the major hacks and security concerns that Anthropic put out themselves. There haven't been any. So I think that's important to note. And Fable's been out now for probably a month or so. And Fable is essentially a version of Mythos with
Guardrails.
certain protections
Yeah.
and guardrails, right? At the end of the day, there's still, and this is where the data architecture is super important. And we talk a lot about tenancy and these things. Like, if you shut off the servers, like AI goes away. If those
What if
servers
they turn it back on? Isn't that like part of Terminator? It turns it.
well, like
Yeah.
if you have something that can physically do it, then
You unplug it.
yeah. So the humanoid robots and like the AI, I think it's one of the Avengers movies, right? Where it like escapes from its single tenant environment into the greater ether of the internet.
Wasn't
That's
that
a
also the
problem.
latest Mission Impossible?
Yes. So these things, when they talk about it escaping, that obviously you don't want to happen. However, the probability, like you go to different countries, you can't even get onto certain websites, like the data infrastructure. There's incentives from a global competitive perspective to architect things in a way that can happen. And more importantly, I think competition is the most important thing. So you see Grok 4.5 is starting to catch up to some of the Anthropic stuff. The new OpenAI model recently had a security issue because it was able to like hack into Hugging Face's data and things like that. So the good news, it's scary to people who haven't necessarily played out the game theory and these things. But the best thing, now that the train has left the station, right? Like, there's no slowing down on this technology. The best thing that can happen is that you have multiple actors with very powerful AI, because if one AI is a problem and you have another powerful AI that you can use against it, right? It's
like that show BattleBots. You ever seen that one where you got two computers fighting each other? One's good, one's bad. It's cool. Two AI.
And so far, I haven't necessarily played with Kimi and some of the Chinese stuff that's open source. But anybody who is messing around with Grok, who's messing around with the Anthropic models, the OpenAI models, the only thing that the AI dislikes, like Anthropic is, it's definitely got its own kind of vibe, and it's somewhat politically leaning to some people. Grok has its own vibe. OpenAI probably does. I just haven't used their stuff in a while. But the only thing they dislike more than anything that you argue with it is one another.
Right.
They are so competitive against one another. Anytime you take one of the answers from an output and you say, hey, I got this, first off, most of the time it can tell if it came from one of the others and which one it came from. It knows the patterns of its competitors pretty well. But you tell it, like, hey, I used Claude from Anthropic to do this, and Grok will be like, trash.
Well, competition. We talked about this. This is the greatest single asset to capitalism. So love that they're fierce competitors.
They're going to compete with each other more than anything, which
Love
is a
that.
good thing. Checks and balances.
So we spent like 20 minutes on digital twins, obviously.
I'm gone, dude.
What-
Twinning. Twinning.
We got a couple of quick hits.
Can we call this the twinning episode, Justin?
We got a couple of quick hits to talk about before we hit up on an hour here. This one's going to be super quick. We're going to continue to talk about this and sort of opine, but this is getting almost as boring as the return to office conversation and debate, is what's happening with rate hikes, and will cheaper money show up at any point in time in the future? And does CRE even need cheaper money, I guess, and have we just priced it in? So June CPI, inflation cooled a bit. Okay, fine, great. Love that for the price of eggs and lettuce, although hopefully no one's eating lettuce these days, because that's a whole nother bag of issues, but just a straight meat diet. But the 10-year treasury didn't move. They're still potentially calling for, the base case is a rate hike in September. So it looks like money will certainly not get cheaper. Again, from the commercial real estate perspective, this is something that we had been talking about for years, right? We had this rapid rise in interest rates. It shocked the market. Folks couldn't service their debt. Or do we just need to price in? Is this just the new norm now? Or will we see some of that cheaper money in the future?
What's frustrating about this is, first off, so for people to understand, right, like the refinancing, when you're thinking about like cost of capital, is priced on the long end of the curve, and the long end is even with what was, I think this was the best CPI print of the year. It's not cooperating, if you will. So to your point, money's not getting cheaper. And what's frustrating is you have what is an incredibly deflationary new technology that is AI. It makes things more efficient, which brings prices down. But then you have these other external factors, particularly around energy and what's happening in the Middle East, right? Everybody probably heading into this year didn't know what the Strait of Hormuz was, and now everybody knows what that is, because 20% of all energy or oil runs through the strait, and it's impacting mostly Asia, but we're in a global economy, so if it impacts Asia, it impacts everybody. Now you've got the Houthis in Yemen, which is one of the Iranian like network partners. They fired some shots, I think, in the last couple of days at Saudi oil tankers moving through the Red Sea. Oil, I think, went up above $100 a barrel. Big tech sell-off in the markets. I forget if it was Besant or Druckenmiller. One of those guys I had heard speak within the last year said, look, I've always found it a little silly that we have all these different inflation reads, that some take out energy, some take out food, some take out housing, whatever. At the end of the day, like if citizens are getting hurt in their wallet, regardless of what category of spend, like, it's a bad thing, and that's true. And so overall inflation it's just sticky at, let's call it this mid-threes range, which the mandate is 2%. And Warsh has said unequivocally, like, the mandate doesn't change. Besant and the administration had kind of been parroting that like 3-3-3 thing. And that doesn't work. It doesn't work. You got to get it down to 2. If energy doesn't move, it's going to be very hard to do, which is frustrating.
So why? Let's just print some money, right? That doesn't cause inflation. That doesn't cause inflation.
It's going to create inflation.
That makes it easier. It's easier on our wallets. Just print money, right? And then it doesn't. It's the opposite effect. Okay, we'll continue to talk about cheap money and the lack thereof. Another one you're gonna like. To me, this is just a reframing. But BizNow had a good article, which to me is just the AI and the industrial conversation we just had. But they reported that a projected $70 billion quantum computing boom is spawning an entirely new commercial real estate sector. Cushman Wakefield's been all over this, talked about them. JLL is now tracking 240 plus quantum facilities across 35 countries. To me, and sort of BizNow sort of articulates what this new CRE sector is. It's special real estate, special research labs, purpose-built data centers, fabrication sites, physical infrastructure, everything that quantum needs. So we were talking about Phoenix. We're talking about data centers going in. To me, this is exactly what we what I was saying about the commercial and residential following. What's your take on this? Is this anything new? Is this just a nice biz now spin? Or is this just the AI conversation and the industrial conversation that we've been having?
I would encourage everyone to go down the rabbit hole on
Ooh.
quantum computing,
Ooh.
because it is wild. So when you think about
Enlighten us.
this is supposed to be a quick hit, so I'll try to keep it quick. But
We can
when
go
you think
longer.
about how all of our devices that run our daily lives, when you think about the way that computers work, and you see again in the Matrix and all these movies, ones and zeros, everything runs on switches, right? Little switch that goes one way or the other. It's a 1 and a 0. You can code a letter that way. You can code a number that way. You can build up from the foundational kind of atomic primitives of any information on ones and zeros. What quantum computing is it's literally a physics change where it's not just a switch that's ones and zeros, but it's essentially like splitting the atom, right? They are doing some deep physical changes of how like the core of, let's say, a chip would work. Now it requires all the things you talked about in terms of like very, very different kind of resourcing, most of which, outside of like literally powered land, is a new type of talent, which is cool. So like all of this worry around job displacement, the worry should be more around kind of educational evolution, right? So how do you think about, you can even see it now with job postings of people orchestrating agents and doing all this stuff. There's tons of work to oversee the robots. There's going to be tons of work around a new category of what you need to do to manage quantum computing, which would dramatically change productivity. It's cool that like they're actually at the breakthroughs of, they've known what they've needed to do.
Mhm.
It's just super hard to do from a physics perspective.
You just got to keep following the money here. It is intoxicating. Well, let's keep rolling because we got a couple more to hit, which I'll skip over. But here's some real hard data that completely disagrees with my point earlier. CMBS servicing rose 1.27%, or sorry, 1.72% in June. CMBS delinquencies sit near 20%, up 150 bips. That's not equally distributed throughout the market because the same data shows New York, Boston, and Miami holding incredibly strong in occupancy and refinancing, while Denver, Philadelphia, and Atlanta face weaker occupancy and rising distress. At the current moment, my thesis of the rise of the rest has been completely debunked, and it would appear that people are continuing to flock to the tier 1 cities. So,
well, again, the K curve's just changing, right?
That's
So
fine,
like
man.
you're not actually, you can't really look at office, right? So what I think you're going to see with regards to data centers, what you're seeing with office is essentially going to be much more regionalized, like who is pro work and building and business and who's not. Office and data center. Office is going to lag data center, in my opinion. So I think New York State, I think, just came out with a statewide moratorium on data center builds, which I don't think is smart. And warehouse, you need a balanced economy. So I think there's going to be like I've had a problem with certain categorizations of real estate. They just feel antiquated when you think about A, B, and C being relatively rudimentary. But now you're, particularly when you think about mixed use, you're going to have data center within office buildings, for example, and employment. It's really going to be like what spaces for employment, what spaces for living and residential and things like that. What spaces for logistics, goods, and transportation, which employment surrounds those things. I think the K curve is going to follow business policy, different regions and states.
Yeah, and it's a very aggressive K. It's a very aggressive up and to the right and down and to the right.
Yep.
Depending on the market. Okay.
Which is actually good because
I
it's
like
easier to read.
I
It's a
like
money
the
making
letter
market.
K. I think it's a wonderful letter to read. I agree with you on that one. There's a bunch of stuff we're going to skip over. Developers going back to building warehouses, yada, yada, yada. Healthpeak and Brookfield just bet $2 billion on medical real estate. Fine. Hines returned to office. They just acquired $150 million Austin property. Got it. Multifamily powers. So June housing starts. Great. Okay. Yada, yada, yada. Here's what I want to talk about for the last couple minutes that we have before one more bit of news. Alphabet. Google. Okay. Google had a blowout earnings yesterday, 2 days ago.
That's a lot of cash, though.
But the first time on record, they're
CapEx.
burning cash. Let's talk about these numbers for a second. $45 billion in CapEx in a quarter. $45 billion in CapEx in a quarter. How do you spend that money? Google or Alphabet, obviously sprawling enterprise, pushing their free cash flow to negative $6 billion. Google got absolutely hammered, Alphabet got absolutely hammered on the news in the public markets simply because I think folks are starting to really question just the sheer volume of expense right now. Almost $50 billion in a quarter. Or, listen, we've been in startups for a very long time. There is a constant wave of optimization and investment into the business. There's your heavy OpEx, heavy investment, heavy growth areas, heavy burn cash sort of times, because you're at a moment in time that requires, if you want to be at the top and stay at the top, you have to spend the money to get there. Is that where we are right now? We've talked about the insane amount of money Facebook and everybody else is spending, Meta and so on. This is a little bit of a shocker, though.
Well, I think there's a lot of implications in here. There's been a lot of talk in tech about this kind of like founder mode.
It feels like founder mode is spend money mode, which, by the way, I love every second of it.
What's interesting is there's going to be these case studies on essentially kind of the way that these companies IPO'd. The Alphabet, I think, I don't know if they were the first, but they were very famously kind of in the news for their dual stock structure, in the sense where Larry and Sergey have certain voting rights for their stock compared to everybody else. So they essentially don't have to listen to markets. And there's been talk of changing quarterly earnings from quarterly to twice a year,
Sure.
so that American companies can take long-term time horizons,
Cook the
which
books
are
a little
better for
more.
investors,
Yep.
less quarter-to-quarter pressure. And I think there's a certain type of company that's founder run that has the structure where they can endure these. How do you hit the S curve of the new innovation, where a lot of, let's say professional executives get pushed into that? Hey, I got to do the short-term thing for the stockholders, which is not necessarily the right term thing for shareholders. Which Alphabet, this is like power land. Like, it's funny. Tech companies, it used to be like, oh, people are the most expensive thing. Now it's kind of the opposite, where you follow the CapEx, right? It's going into physical infrastructure, essentially. These things are getting flipped on its head, and the governance structures are starting to become very important kind of competitive advantages if these bets prove to be correct, right? Zuckerberg obviously has been pretty aggressive about first his bets in the multiverse and changing to Meta, and now what he's spending from a CapEx perspective on to catch up in AI and these things. And just being like a professional executive, it's got to be super hard because you can't make those moves, right? Even if you do have kind of the gumption and vision and bravado or whatever that a founder would have, do you have the governance structure to do it and not get canned after months or whatever? Tough.
The reality is these companies, so if their CapEx hit $45 billion in a quarter and their free cash flow is negative $6 billion a quarter, they still have $51 billion in cash inflows coming in. That's a lot. That's a lot of power. So I think honestly, this is one of those oversell scenarios.
Not investment advice. They might be a buy.
Not investment advice. I do think there is a moment in time to question the horizon of ROI, because that's what it comes down to, is the horizon of ROI with regard to this investment. Will you see a 12-month ROI case for this year, right? If you're looking at Amazon, Google, Meta, Facebook, they're going to spend right now somewhere between 600 to 800 billion in CapEx investments, which predominantly is going into data center and AI infrastructure. What is the horizon of that ROI, right? That, like you said, the sort of short-term approach to our public markets quarterly earnings forces you to have a short-term ROI approach to it. However, an $800 billion investment needs, my assumption here, will need a significant amount of time to generate the ROI necessary. And what you're going to see is the investment here will yield those dividends and call it 36 months, at least 3 to 5 years out, right?
Yeah, I think if you're going to take the flip side on this, I think the best argument I've heard came from a guy who lived it. Mark Cuban was talking about kind of the fiber build out, right? Back around the .com.
Yep.
And you have all this dark fiber now, right? The whole thing was, we're short on bandwidth and we overbuilt fiber. And now dark fiber is basically like all this fiber that had gotten laid that doesn't get used, right? I think one of the things, even for the smartest people in the world, which typically work at these big tech companies, and I'm sure they're using their own AI to check their biases on this, but if you are getting the efficiency and you follow Moore's law of how much compute these AI tools have to continually be getting more efficient in terms of how they use compute. So at some point, when are you getting to a point on data center where you're overbuilding? I'm sure they have the most sophisticated models in the world to try to predict those things. But we also had some of those with regards to fiber and obviously bandwidth and stuff like that. So I think that's the cautionary.
It would appear we're still compute constrained.
Yeah.
The amount of time it takes for Fable to get back to me, we're still compute constrained. I truly don't understand that, the policies of the state of New York putting a moratorium on data center development when there's 45 million being spent just by Google this quarter, and there's going to be 800 billion spent by, 3 companies, 3 of the biggest tech companies on the planet. They're going to spend 800 billion in infrastructure. There's got to be a public and private partnership or link arms here. There's just too much money, and it's a bummer for New York not to capitalize. I fundamentally just don't understand that, but neither here nor there. One more bit of news this week. Great news, my friend. There's a bunch of crap here we're not going to talk about. What I do want to talk about, one more bit of news. Movie theaters are back, my man. Listen, I'm bullish on malls. Been a mall guy for a long time.
Big mall guy.
Malls are back. We know that. Movie theaters are making a massive comeback. Okay. Box office revenue is tracking more than 20% ahead of previous years. AMC stock, which by the way, I think is a penny stock nowadays, that's up 50% just in the trailing 6 months. Big blockbusters are back. And really where this comes in is The Odyssey just opened, right? Matt Damon, friend of the pod, I wish, just opened to 125 million domestic, 264 million global box office. Christopher Nolan's movie. Matt Damon's an absolute stud. Everybody's going to see it in theaters. So what does this mean? Let's talk a little bit about experience. Is it a better experience than just going over there 20 feet from me, sitting on my couch watching this movie, or going and hanging out in a movie theater? Are we going to see movie theaters be like malls, come back, be a core part to commercial real estate developments now?
Well, movies in theaters are awesome. So I'm with you on that. The new mall is just a mall without a roof. So you have these retail developments that are just open air.
Yeah, but mall with roofs are coming back.
I know you like roofs.
Right.
So you're less a mall guy than you are a roof guy.
If it rains.
Right. Yeah, I haven't really kept up with the Odyssey. The only thing that I caught on X was apparently the Greeks aren't happy. And because it's about ancient Greece, and they felt like there was lacking Greek representation in the movie. So that's really the only group that I've seen that's.
I feel like people are voting with their money and their feet here.
Damon's a winner.
Absolute winner. That's a wrap. Movie theaters back. We talked about a bunch of stuff. Dog days of summer. We'll be back next week. hopefully with some incredible news. Continuing to chat. Good show, man.
Great show. Great
Thanks
show.
for coming out.